So after e4, c5, let's start our investigation of the Sicilian with the romantic move b4. C takes b4, a3. Well, if d4, d5 is fine, a3. Well, it really doesn't work. I don't advise you to play it with white. If you want to play like this, then already better to play it after second knight f3, d6, b4. We are going to consider it later during this course. There actually white is not worse, at least. Not better, of course, but not worse. Here, I believe if you start with b4 with this pawn sacrifice immediately, well, black will just be better, actually in more than one way. I don't think that c5 is such a terrible move that you have to punish your opponent immediately by such an aggressive play, sacrificing the pawn. But seriously, yeah, it's not really an option in my opinion, because let's say the most logical is just to play d5. E takes d5, queen takes d5. Now you cannot take back the pawn because you are losing the rook on a1. Yeah, so a takes b4, queen e5 check, obviously, and then you take the rook. So this is just losing. Therefore, white has to play, let's say, knight f3, and now black can play e5. Actually, is quite a good and very well, principal move, but if you want to be safe, you can always play e6. Let's say bishop b2, knight f6, bishop e2, knight c6, then black develops, and white has a little bit of compensation. Maybe even if he is lucky, he can equalize somehow dynamically the position, but it's clear that it's only black who can be better here. So b4 is not recommended. Yeah, of course, white can start to fight for the center immediately, playing d4 right here, but this is also not great, because after c takes d4, the problem is that you have to take with the queen, if you take back the pawn at all, but then white losing tempest, knight c6, let's say queen d2, knight f6, knight c3, and you will see in one of the lessons about the Sicilian, it will be a lesson concerning the second knight c3. If black have played d6 already, at least this line is playable for white. Here, black can either play g6, but the simplest, I believe, is e6 and followed by d5. Well, white lost tempest with his queen, and I'm sure black has no problem whatsoever in this position. But most of the time, if somebody already played d4, then white continues with c3. Again, I don't think c5 is so bad that white has to play so aggressively and start sacrificing material. Obviously, it's not great for white, so also I do not really recommend it. Okay, maybe in a 3 minutes blitz game, maybe, but still I don't think it's prosperous even in short time control, because to start with, black can just play knight f6, and there is nothing better for white than to play e5, and after knight d5, it's pure transposition to the line e4, c5, c3, which I'm going to cover later. So that is a minimum black can do, but of course, if I was black, if I was lucky enough to face d4, cd, c3, I would definitely grab the pawn, d takes c3, knight takes c3, let's say knight c6, knight f3, e6, then black develops. Well, white has a little development advantage, but he gave up a central pawn for that, and it's pretty clear that it's black who is fighting for advantage, or maybe being even more radical, black is already better, probably objectively. He has a pawn. So this is a bit, a strange way of playing for white, to give up pawns on this move 2. Yeah, that's not really recommended usually in the openings, in any openings actually. So now let us try to keep cool after e4, c5 as white, and to avoid giving up pawns for free. And there is a move which had a certain moment of popularity, which is b3, second b3. Actually, I played it twice, and I won both games against strong grandmasters, Kabalia and Inarkiyev, and that raised the popularity of this move. Not for too long. It's not a refutation of the Sicilian, but it has some point. But again, nowadays with computers, it's becoming more and more difficult to to have such moves in your repertoire for too long, because top players, they analyze it with engines, and obviously b3 cannot really give an advantage. So the idea, what is the idea? Well, normally the point is that I will explain you why I came up with this second b3, because after knight f3, let's say d6, if white is playing b3, then black would just play, let's say, knight c6, bishop b2, e5. It's very logical to put the kind of barrier for white's b2 bishop, and black is having just a good game. Bishop on b2 is not very active. So the idea is that by playing second b3, I still have an option to play f4 in many variations. So for instance, here d6, bishop b2, e5 is already not so good, I believe. White has a very nice initiative because his knight is not yet on f3, and he can start to push f4. Let's say by playing knight c3, knight c6, bishop c4, knight f6, and knight e2. Yeah, so I put the knight on e2, castle, and then play f4, and actually white probably having a nice plus in this position. So this setup with d6, e5, which works perfectly when white has a knight on f3, doesn't work so well already in this position. But of course, black has other options. So the most simple, I would say, way of playing is knight c6, let's say bishop b2, d6, one of possible options. Yeah, let's say if you don't know much about b3, which is not going to be the case after you listen to this course and to this particular lesson, then you can always play like this. I think my idea was to play with f4. So you see that's the point, to play f4, knight f3. And then very often white is trying to castle long, let's say knight c3, g6, and maybe then bishop b5, knight f3. Again, it's a playable position for white with a pawn on f4. I think something like that was my plan against this setup. Or let's say bishop b5 is also possible, bishop d7, f4, knight f6, queen e2, for instance. Black can play e6, knight f3, bishop e7, and it's a complicated playable position. Definitely white can play. Yeah? It's perfectly playable for white. And not that it's giving an advantage, but it's a complicated game which is not analyzed yet. The problem was when engines of course found g6. Actually, the whole idea of playing b3 is to stop in a way, or at least to make it more difficult for black to develop the bishop on g7. But it occurs that g6 is still possible, and actually it's a very good move. You need to know some lines here after g6 because it looks a bit scary. But it's what I would recommend you if you want to play black against b3. I think g6 is a very, very straightforward, and it's a good move. Bishop b2, knight f6. Of course, if you play knight c3 here, bishop g7, then the problem is knight takes e4 is threatening, and e5 doesn't work. Knight h5, and actually the pawn on e5 start to be a target in this position. Black is even better according to the engines here. Of course, you can always protect the pawn with a move like d3, but that was not the idea. Black just develops castles, pushes d5 one day, and will be at least equal. But of course, the critical move is e5 here. e5, knight d5, and even though it looks a bit dangerous for black, because for instance, white can play e6, but it doesn't bring much because of f6, or bishop c4. Also simply knight b6, and it seems that black is doing perfectly fine. at least according to the computer, and it's quite an authority. So queen f3, this is the first line of the computer, and actually a move which was played in a game Andreikin Vashila Graph. But black is also doing very fine here. Knight b4, knight a3, bishop g7. Very strange play, yeah, as you can see. Complicated position, but I would rather prefer black actually here, even though the engines assess it as more or less equal, but white has a little bit strange way of playing. Knight on a3, queen on f3. So e6 is a move now. Well, actually black can play f6 with a perfectly reasonable position, but maybe castle is more principal. Bishop takes g7, king takes g7. Let's say ef, rook f7, queen g3, knight c6, c3, knight d5. Very strange position. Computers, engines assess it as, well, more or less equal. It's very complicated, of course, very double-edged. I would probably take black if you ask me, because yes, better development, but white is also okay here. Yeah, it's just a complicated, unclear position on the board. So so b3 definitely better than b4, that's for sure, and I think it's playable for white. I mean, probably your opponents will not know it very well what to do against b3. I don't promise you an advantage here, but it's at least black cannot really play in this very standard way, as very often happens in those anti-Sicilian, so to say. So black usually goes knight c6, g6, bishop g7, and then his play is very simple. Here black has to start to think from the very early stage of the game. Play is a bit unusual, so possible especially for shorter time controls. b3 is an option. As to black, yeah, as I've mentioned already, you can definitely just play knight c6, d6. You will not get a bad position just playing, you know, in a simple way. But probably g6 is the most straightforward, the most principal move, and it seems to be doing perfectly fine for black. So that was the second b3 move, which brought some good memories to me because of a couple of nice victories. Then, okay, what else white can do? He can try to play in like, you know, in the style of King's Indian. So trying just to play a game, of course, not really fighting for an advantage, but trying to get King's Indian with a tempi up, even with a pawn on f4 already, you know, and then knight f3. Quite well, some people, they don't like main Sicilians because there is a lot of theory and it's very double-edged, so they like to play this slow game, avoiding theory. But it's not extremely prosperous, I would say. First of all, black can always do knight c6 and g6. That is always possible and always perfectly playable and fine. But in case of this move order, if white starts with g3, I think d5 is a very good way to equalize here. I mean, there is no problem. That's why g3 went actually out of fashion completely, because of d5, in my opinion. So now what to do? d3 is a bit poor, yeah, because first of all you can just go knight c6, so with the idea that in case of bishop g2 already d4 is even better than immediate d4, and if white goes knight d2, then just playing e5 and King's Indian. Okay, white has a tempi up, but especially considering that the knight is already on d2, of course, there is no real chance to get an advantage here for white. Okay, he probably is not worse, I mean, here, because he has a tempi, but no advantage. So that is also nice, knight c6. If you want to equalize, I think d4 and queen takes d1, you can equalize king takes d1, knight c6, because white will still has to solve a certain, you know, issue with his king here. But normally white tries to take on d5, queen takes d5, knight f3, and now the game gets pretty direct. Bishop g4, bishop g2, and very important, queen e6 check, because otherwise if white manages to castle, then this exposed queen on d5, white can have chances to get an advantage. But after queen e6 check, obviously queen e2 is just nothing for white. So white usually plays king f1 in this position, and simply knight c6, h3, bishop h5. Well, even taking on f3 actually is also pretty okay for black. I mean, takes, queen d7 and just e6. I think it's because of this d4 square for the knight, and in case if white plays c3, then d3 pawn is a bit weak. I think the position is more or less equal. But I would advise you to play bishop h5 with black, trying to keep the bishop. Let's say d3, queen d7. So black just wants to develop e6, knight f6, bishop e7. And at least white should try to get the bishop, g4, bishop g6, knight h4, e6. And some games here of quite good players. I think Sveshnikov, strong grandmaster, he liked at some point to play like this with white. Okay, white will have two bishops, but his king is still not in a good position. He will have to spend time somehow to get the h1 rook into the game, and black is very solid. So I think there is no problem at all for black in this here. I would probably even, prefer to be black here, because it's a bit easier to play. Because white's king, even one day it lands on g2, but still there are all those black squares, potentially weak around the king. The knight might get to f4 one day, black's knight. It's far, of course, from realizing it, but you never know. So I'm not very optimistic about white's prospects. Okay, he's not worse, that's okay, but no real chance for advantage. And what is even worse for white, that black's play is very simple. So g3, d5 would be my recommendation. I think it's a very simple way to equalize. Therefore, sometimes white starts with d3. Same idea after knight c6. The idea is to play g3 now. And at least, in case of d5, he has some options, even though d5 is still very good, yeah, as we discussed it earlier. After g3, d5, d3, the knight c6 is possible. And I think d5 is the simplest way to equalize, because now probably, again, as I mentioned, probably knight d2 should be played, but then black is just fine. And in case of e takes d5, queen d5, knight f3, here it actually leads to a forced draw, basically. If black wants, knight d4, bishop g2, bishop h3, bishop takes h3, knight takes f3 check, king f1, knight d2 check. Okay, rook on h1 is hanging, so if king g1 is a perpetual, white can try to play for a win, but probably it's not recommended, because after king e2, for some reason, I guess in case of knight takes b1, white is not going to take back because of queen h5 check, but first stop queen h5 check and then trying to take on b1, even though I'm not sure it is so clear. But at minimum, you can check on h5 and take on h3. Let's say b3, queen d7, and okay, white with this very strange king in the center, it's not going to be better, but maybe he will equalize, slowly making this artificial long castle like bishop b2, knight c3, queen f3, rook a1, king c1, but black will use this time to develop, and the position is equal. So d5 is a very simple way of playing, but I wanted just to show you as example that g6 is also perfectly playable. That was, by the way, played by Garry Kasparov in 2001 in classical chess against Fedorov. Quite a strong grandmaster from Belarus who won the B tournament in Vaikanze previous year, and he played in the main event. And we can see that that kind of setup is always possible for black and always perfectly playable. Well, white's idea is that he can get f4, knight f3, and we will consider this position with a knight on c3, white knight on c3 in the next lesson. But here white tries to pretend that since knight c3 haven't been played yet, that he has a better version of this closed Sicilian. But in fact, it's not clear if it gives white any better version than normal situation, because Gary actually played very well this game. Well, no surprise. Well, the only maybe difference that with a knight on c3, e6, knight e7 plan is usually considered to be perfectly fine. Here, maybe white can get c3, trying to push d4, and it might cause black some troubles, even though still not so clear. But knight f6, this setup is always perfectly playable for black. Castle, and probably white must still go knight c3, trying to stop b5, because, well, Fedorov, he decided to just to attack straight away, but you know, there is no mate really here. It's very far from mate, and black, he gave black a chance to push his pawns quickly on the other side. A very typical play. Here I would still probably prefer somehow maybe to play like knight c3, knight e2, trying to get the knight to g3. But black also has quite a serious play in this position, so it wouldn't really give any advantage for white. But again, white just played for the direct attack, f5, b4, queen e1, so queen h4, bishop h6, and mate, yeah? That's the plan, but it's there is no mate. It's very far from mate, and black is starting his counterplay, and he is actually quicker with his counterplay. And after bishop a6, queen h4, c4, in fact, white position started to fall apart here, and Gary won actually on move 25 here. So you see that this g6, bishop g7 is a perfectly playable plan against all those move orders. So that's always an option if you don't want to play d5, you know, if you don't want to enter some more direct play, then always possible to play g6. So those are not really d3 or g3 are not really ways for white to fight for advantage. It's just more or less, I think, white is saying, okay, I don't want to play Sicilian, I'm scared, and I just want to play a game without any theory, but it will, not cause problems for black. And then, what else? Recently, there was a very strange attempt to play bishop e2. We will move to the second f4. I will explain you why. I mean, you'll understand why bishop e2 actually they start sometimes. Even some quite strong grandmasters they played, like Nigel Short against Sergei Karyakin, played in a classical chess bishop e2. But again, it's not giving any advantage, obviously, to white. After knight c6, f4. So the idea is that in case of d5, white is playing d3, and after d4, queen d1, of course, he wants to take with a bishop on d1, and that makes a difference. Probably white can count on a certain plus, even though after b6, bishop b7, still not clear if white is really better in this endgame. But okay, white will play c3, knight f3, bishop e3. It's playable for white, this endgame. So that's why bishop e2, because in case of f4, there is d5. Second d5, as we will see later in this lesson, the end of this lesson, that second f4 d5, black is doing perfectly fine here. That's why bishop e2, but again, to start with, I don't see anything what is wrong with g6, and I think that is what was played by Karyakin. Knight f3, bishop g7, castles d6. So again, if you don't know what to do, or if you don't know theory, just play like this, and no big problem for sure. For instance, the game can develop in this fashion: c3, knight f6, d3, castles, king h1, just white, because in case if white starts with bishop e3, then probably knight g4 will come. So king h1 just to play bishop e3, and after knight g4 that white has bishop g1, and black starts his usual play, b5, a3, a5. I give you this variation just to show how the game can proceed. Of course, it's far from forced, this line. Bishop e3, bishop b7, let's say knight d2, b4. Why not immediately before, even though there are other moves, of course, black has. And let's say d4, cd, cd, e6, and this position is perfectly fine for black. Computer assesses it as equal, even slightly prefer black. Well, it's just a complicated game to me. Yeah, definitely. I wouldn't be unhappy with black with the opening result, having this position. So that is always possible, but d5 is more principled. d3 and simply e6. I think it's also perfectly good for black. Knight f3 and now bishop d6. So this setup and knight to e7. So probably white should try sooner or later to play e5, because if he tries just to play like this, castle knight e7, c3, then f6. And bishop e3 castles, let's say king h1, b6. Well, black has a very nice position, control on the center, and I would say that he's maybe already little better, slightly better, but at least equal. So then e5 is more principal, bishop c7, and now this position reminds very much French defense, but black has a very good version of it, because white lost tempest with d3, then probably he will have to play d4 one day. Also, f4 is usually not the way white is playing in this French. So here a very typical French play. I mean, with black the castles and then trying to go f6, let's say knight a3, f6. And he has a very good position. I mean, again, I would rather, even though it's probably equal, I would rather prefer black here. It's easier to play. Let's say d4, takes, and now, by the way, a very important, nice maneuver, which every French player knows very well. Bishop d7, let's say king h1, bishop e8. Yeah, bishop enters via this diagonal, g6, and black has developed. All pieces are good. There is a certain pressure on the d4 pawn potentially, and has no problem at all. So again, after bishop e2, you can choose whether you just play g6 and you're fine with black, whether you play e6, d5, bishop d6. I also think it's very prosperous. So bishop e2, also I wouldn't recommend to play. I mean, there are many sidelines white has, but it's a possible sideline, but not the most prosperous. I mean, there are better lines if you want if you want to avoid with white playing main Sicilian, then there are better moves than bishop e2, in my opinion. There is another option, is to play knight e2, second knight e2. Well, actually, strange looking move. In fact, the only point of playing knight e2, as I understand it, is to try to avoid Najdorf. Because you cannot really avoid anything else with this move. For instance, if knight c6, probably white's idea is to play d4 immediately, or knight c3, knight f6, d4, just to again to move to the main Sicilian, but avoiding Najdorf, which is d6, knight f6, a6. Yeah. So the same goes after e6. Probably white's idea is just to play d4. And after d6, again, you can play d4, move to the main position, but then it's not quite clear why knight e2 was played. I mean, knight f3 is more logical and simple. I think white's idea is to play here knight c3, for instance. Again, in case of knight c6, you just go d4 and move into this position, already avoiding Najdorf. And after knight f6, the only idea for white is to play g3, bishop g2. So white tries to pretend that the knight on f6 is not the best setup with a knight f6, but it's still very good enough. It's perfectly fine. And now, depending on what Sicilian you play, if you're playing Sicilians with e6, I would advise you, it's perfectly fine just to play e6 here. But, and let's say bishop g2, bishop e7, probably white will play d4, and then you get to this position, which is perfectly fine for black. Okay, it is playable, white can play, yeah, but it's a very, very good version of for black of these g3 systems, because he managed to develop already. Usually black has certain trouble developing in those g3, for instance, against the Taimanov system. I will show it to you later. So here has no problem. So e6 perfectly fine, but again, I believe g6 is good. Bishop g2, bishop g7, and white can play d4, but okay, it can be a bit scary for people who do not play dragon, yeah, because this is a dragon already, but nothing to worry about really, because g3 is a really harmless system against dragons, maybe one of the very few systems which are very harmless, yeah. So here you don't even need to know much with black. There is not, yeah, you just play normal moves, castle, knight c6, and now there is a problem with a knight on d4. If bishop e3, there is knight g4. If knight b3, then bishop g4 is good. Let's say f3, bishop e6, or bishop d7, both moves are perfectly fine. So finally, white usually plays knight d2 in this position. By the way, we are different move order. We are getting to my old game with black against Vasily Ivanchuk. I think it was Horgen 95. And, well, I was doing well in this game. Vasily finally managed to save it, but I was better at some point. So then black is playing rook b8 usually, and just trying to get b5. Let's say a4, a6, then pushing b5. There is some theory, but it's really quite harmless. I mean, black is doing perfectly fine here. So then white has a choice of doing this, or let's say castle, knight c6, d3, playing like that. But as I've mentioned already, those positions are completely okay for black. So I just give you an example how the game can proceed. Here, h3, rook b8, a very typical plan. Yeah, black is just pushing pawns on the queen side and not being afraid of this f4, g4, because it's very, very far from mate or anything like mate. It's more a positional play, which somehow, in my opinion, is a bit simpler to play with black, actually. So a bit easier, and in general, black has very good statistics in those positions. In fact, statistics is in black's favor here, not because black is better, because maybe it's easier to play this. So now the only thing that, let's say, after f4 you should avoid, of course, a typical blunder, which is b5 immediately here, because then e5 comes, and that is something you should avoid because it's losing a piece. But the typical way of playing is, let's say, to go knight e8 here, and then followed by b5 or knight d7. Both moves are okay. g4, b5, and it's a typical position. Let's say white can try to put his pieces like that, but black would just push pawns. e5 here is quite harmless, and in general, yeah, black has a simple, clear play on the queen side, and I don't know how white can really create any real play on the king side. So I was always worried, scared to play with these positions with white. I had a feeling it's very easy to get worse. So I mean, this knight e2 move is first of all, the idea is only to avoid neither. So if your opponent doesn't play neither, then it doesn't make sense to play knight e2. And even though avoiding this, maximum white can get is those positions after g3, e6 or g6. Both of those variations are perfectly okay for black, especially g6. Yeah, so I don't really see any big idea in playing knight e2. And now let's move to f4, second f4, which actually brings some good memories to me, because I used to play it all my childhood, because I didn't know theory really. Didn't have many books in my provincial town, so wanted to find something against Sicilian just that I can play, and f4 was decided that it's an interesting option. So at some point I played many games, actually sometime on the level of when I was 2000, 2100 player. Even actually up to a certain quite a decent level. I think I stopped playing it already when was getting to 2400. Only then I decided that it's really not good enough. But the idea is usually white actually tries this type of plan playing f4 knight f3, but usually starts with knight c3, and then let's say after knight c6 or d6 playing f4. That we will consider in the next lesson. But my idea was after f4 that maybe I can try to play with those move orders. So sometimes against certain lines I would still put the knight on c3, but against some lines, for instance, if black is playing g6 here, maybe white can try to do knight f3, bishop g7, and let's say c3 already, trying to go d4. Still a big question if it gives something, but at least, that was my plan. Of course, black can just play e6, and after knight f3, d5, probably nothing really better for white than to play knight c3 here, and let's say knight c6, and it gets to the theory which we will consider in the next lesson. But the problem of the second f4, otherwise it wouldn't be, it would be more convenient to start with f4 instead of knight c3. But the problem is that d5 is actually very strong, and that made me stop playing f4 one day, because now what to do? I think I played once in the junior Soviet Union junior championship. I played bishop b5 check here. Okay, bishop d7 took and played d3, trying to pretend that in case of d4 this endgame maybe is slightly better for white. But of course black can just play in a simple fashion like this, castles bishop d6, let's say queen e2 knight e7, and it's just an equal position. Well, black has no problem at all. So that was a bit of a desperation, this bishop b5 check. Then in the same tournament I played knight c3 also. The problem is that, okay, first of all, d4 is perfectly okay for black, also knight e2, knight c6, and knight f3, trying to go knight g3, but then quite often h5 comes, so very unclear position, probably quite good for black objectively. But the main problem is d4, knight takes e4, and now at that time it was 1989, again Soviet Union Junior Championship under 18. Well, I was just 13, I think, at that time. And normally black would automatically play e6, but then after knight f3, I would continue with g3, bishop g2, etc., and perfectly playable for white. But the problem is that knight f6 actually is very, very powerful here. Because in case if you take on f6, ef6, then the pawn on f4 is really badly placed, and computer already given quite a considerable advantage for black in this position, so this is not really playable. Also knight takes e5, okay, that was the point, but at that time we had no computer, so since the pawn on c5 was hanging, was very logical to play e6 to protect it, but here, of course, engines are very quickly realizing that you can sacrifice it and play e5, and here black has a very powerful initiative and at least not worse. So knight f6 seems to be almost a refutation of the system. I mean, probably white's best is to play d3 and try to equalize here, but no chance for advantage. So knight c3 is harmless. Then ed5, of course I also played ed5. I told you I played many games on f4. But now knight f6. Okay, queen d5, knight c3, and knight f3. Here white has a quite considerable advantage in development and actually has chances for an advantage in this position. But knight f6, yeah, that's what you need to know if you are black, that this position is actually quite good for black. I mean, really good. So I finally couldn't really find any idea for white here how to play. Was not satisfied with any position which I can get, and that was why I stopped playing f4 and finally moved to main Sicilians. At that moment, started to explore the real chess, main Sicilians. So here knight f6. Well, white can get a pawn. Actually, can be pawn up in two different ways, but both gives black a lot of compensation and actually at least equal position. So let's say if white is playing c4, then simply e6, d6, bishop e6, and now black doesn't need to hurry. Actually, he just has a, for example, the game can develop in this fashion: rook e8, knight c3, can even play h6. In fact, computer nowadays is giving a slight advantage to black in this position. It's difficult to play with white. Black just has a long-term compensation, playing slow chess without any hurry, just very nice position. This d4 square is weak. Of course, pawn on f4 is not the best also piece, in white's position. So again, according to computer, slightly better for black here. And then another way is taking pawn is bishop b5 check, bishop d7. Now bishop c4, black can simply take back the pawn like this, and he is at least equal. So bishop takes d7 check, queen takes d7, c4. Okay, otherwise, of course, black would just take the pawn on d5, knight c6, and being, well, probably slightly better, or, well, at least, let's be unambitious, at least equal. And after c4, still e6, and if d6, queen e6 check, queen e2, just takes knight c6, and black, wants to long castle to play knight b4. So very powerful compensation. Maybe better for white to start with queen e2 at least. But black just develops bishop d6, and after very normal logical moves here, rook a8, black just wants to play e5. And again, here probably white is fine. I mean, white is not worse, but there is no chance really to be better. Let's say after knight c3, black just plays e5, very healthy play. For black, everything is in the center, pieces are active, and according to engines, well, it's probably white who has to be careful and trying to equalize here somehow. So that is a very simple way of playing against f4. And actually, I think that is considered to be, kind of almost a refutation of the second f4. You play d5, ed, knight f6, and it's not clear what white can do about it. The game gets pretty direct. But again, if you, for some reason, playing black, you don't like to give a pawn, you can still play, for example, e6, and this position we will consider it also. It's very unclear as well. But to me, I mean, d5 is just a killer of f4. So, all in all, we've considered lots of different moves. After e4, c5, none of those moves are dangerous for black. So now, as black, you know exactly what to do against those sidelines. And talking about white, I would say that probably if you want to pick up at least one weapon, out of this lesson, then probably b3 is in my opinion, it's the most interesting way to play. I would still, advise you to play second knight f3 and main Sicilians. But b3 can be an option, can be a weapon, especially in blitz, in short time controls, because the game is non-standard here, and black has to start to play on his own, usually at the quite early stage of the game. And if you analyze it a bit, maybe you can be successful with this second b3. Other moves, frankly, okay, of course it's a matter of taste, but I don't see too many prospects for white in all other second moves which we've considered today. So, and then we are going to move now to the second knight c3, and after second c3, which is a very serious sideline, I mean, with a lot of theory, before starting to study knight f3, which, well, definitely is the best move in the position.